I'm Aaron Meyer, and you're listening to the 19-9 Podcast. Today, we're going to talk with retired Western Athletic Conference Commissioner Jeff Hurd. Jeff spent nearly 5 decades in college athletics, and we're going to talk about where college hoops has been and where it could be going.
You hit on it with some of the flamboyant coaches that were in the conference at the time. BYU, obviously, always a strong basketball program. When Rick Majerus came to Utah, Utah had a strong program, but Rick really elevated it.
We also discuss his memories of the Missouri Valley Conference when a Larry Bird-led Indiana State team charged into the national title game in 1979.
I'm going to start this with a little bit of a funny story. As the director of public relations for the conference, we did a media guide that year that used a picture of Larry Bird. And I'll never forget that because as soon as it came out, I had a coach call me and scream at me.
It's time to start the show.
Isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that three-point line? It's all theirs. Nice move by Steve Fisher here.
So, Jeff, thanks for joining us here on the 19-9 Podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. I look forward to this.
All right. So you retired as a commissioner of the WAC about a year ago. So what's life been like for you in retirement, Jeff?
Well, I don't get as many phone calls from angry coaches or athletic directors or university presidents. That's for sure. It's been good. No, it's been. I think anytime you spend nearly 5 decades in a business in one form or another, there is certainly an adjustment period. At the same time, it's time for a different phase of my life, and I think I've transitioned fairly well, and still look forward to more of it. I still can't play golf very well, even though I've tried, but I've been involved and I stay busy, and certainly I'm interested in what's going on around me. But from a day-to-day basis, I don't wake up in the middle of the night thinking, "What do we do next?"
You mentioned you don't get those calls from the coaches or the presidents anymore. For those who maybe aren't familiar with the role of a Division I athletics commissioner, conference commissioner, just how would you kind of define the roles and responsibilities of a commissioner, that role you inherited for a decade?
Well, it's both simple and difficult. Simple from the standpoint that you have many bosses. You have administrators, you have coaches, you have fans, you have university officials, you have boosters that are out there that obviously are not directly your boss, but you certainly have to answer questions and listen to their comments on occasion. So you answer to a lot of different people, and you have to solve any problem that comes about. It ultimately lands on your desk and in your lap, and you are expected to somehow be able to handle each of them, and none of them are the same, if that makes any sense. But at the same time, it's a challenging job, but it's also one that I enjoyed. It's when you have some issues that you have to face, while they're frustrating at times, you also have a great deal of satisfaction when you're able to solve some of them. And ultimately, you're trying to do what's best for intercollegiate athletics, not just for your conference, but for all the athletes in the conference that you represent. We focus on basketball or football or whatever, but in our conference, we had 20 championship sports, 10 on each side, men and women. So from a commissioner standpoint, one way or another, you're involved in all of them.
Absolutely. So, let's go back. We talked about here being the commissioner, which is the last decade of your career, but let's go back more than 40 years. I mentioned in the intro here after some time at Tulsa, you entered the league side of college athletics when you joined the Missouri Valley Conference in 1978. And you picked a great time to join the Valley because 1978-1979 basketball season is arguably the most remarkable hoop season in MVC history. And that's because of one guy, Larry Bird at Indiana State. So you're the conference's director of public relations that season, your debut season there at the Valley. What sticks out about that season? in that season, because it's not often, especially in the pre-internet age, that a Missouri Valley team would take the nation by storm. So what was that basketball season in the Valley like?
Well, I'm going to start this with a little bit of a funny story as a director of public relations for the conference. But we did a media guide that year that used a picture of Larry Bird. It was actually a painting of Larry Bird on the cover. And I'll never
Who'd
forget
already
it
been
because-
drafted by the Celtics too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that because as soon as it came out, I had a coach call me and scream at me and tell me that if his school spent $1 for the production of that media guide, then I should be fired. So that was kind of my introduction to that. But that aside, it was, I was at a time in my career I was certainly a bit naive, a little bit awestruck by where I was in my job. And also, even though I knew about Larry Bird and I knew that he was a highly regarded basketball player, I actually didn't realize how highly regarded and how good he really was until I had the opportunity to see him play and get to know him a little bit. But what I remember most about that year, and this is, you take it all the way into the conference season, there's actually a couple things, but one at the time, Indiana State was playing a conference game at Las Cruces, New Mexico, against New Mexico State. And at that time, New Mexico State's always had a good basketball program, certainly did at that time. They had an individual there his name was Slab Jones. He was a 6'9" center, very, very good player. Indiana State, of course, had Larry Bird. About 13,000 people were there at the Pan American Center at New Mexico State. But the game comes down in regulation. New Mexico State they have a 2-point lead with, I believe it was either 3 or 4 seconds left in the game, and New Mexico State shooting a free throw at their end of the court. Well, for Indiana State's standpoint, that free throw was good. It was good because it missed. And they get the rebound, and outlet pass goes to a guy named Bob Heaton, who throws in one from midcourt to tie the game. A lot of people remember that as that won the game from Indiana State and kept their record unbeaten, but actually just tied it and sent the game to overtime. Indiana State wins in overtime. Even though it was my first year, it's one of the greatest games, most exciting games that I ever was a part of in my entire time in the WAC. And so that was you want to say is my introduction to Larry Bird, because he also had a heck of a game as an individual, but from just a standpoint of a college basketball and the excitement of a game and how it ended, that was it. What I also remember was when Indiana State, they ended up going to Lawrence, Kansas, as a WAC rep, as a Missouri Valley rep, going to the NCAA tournament, as did New Mexico State that year. But Indiana State that year had to go through Virginia Tech, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and DePaul to get to the championship game against, as we all know, Michigan State and Magic Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what a lot of people may forget, one is the game against Arkansas was a 2-point win in the Elite Eight for Indiana State. They won on the same Bob Heaton. It's a left-hander from middle of the lane to win that game by 2. Arkansas at that time was one of the best college teams I had ever seen too. They had Sidney Moncrief, Marvin Delph, and that group with that team. But then so Indiana State goes to the Final Four, and that Final Four we all know about Indiana State. We know about Michigan State with Magic Johnson and Judd Heathcote was a coach, and but the other two teams there, one was DePaul, and Mark Aguirre played for DePaul. Ray Meyer was the coach, iconic program, one of the best players in the country also. But the fourth member of that Final Four, which many people may not remember, Penn.
Absolutely, the last Ivy League school in the Final Four.
That's right. And that Final Four was my first that I'd ever seen. It was played at the Holman Center at the University of Utah, a 15,000-seat arena. Now, think about that today, trying to play a Final Four in a 15,000-seat arena.
Mm-hmm.
You probably couldn't get most of the media in there if that size. But that was my introduction to the Final Four, my introduction to just the excitement of the Final Four, and of course had a vested interest with Indiana State playing in it. But just that aside, when you think of what else was there, and what it took Indiana State to get there. Even though they lost the championship game, it was a phenomenal year, and one that I obviously will always remember. And to me, it's almost like it happened just in the last few years.
Yeah. Did you think they were all going to be like that?
Well, I was hoping. I remember, another side story to this. At the Missouri Valley, we were fighting to try to get, national recognition, get on television, and these are pre-ESPN days, and just trying to make a name for ourselves and trying to get a game or two on television. I'll never forget one of the network people telling me, "Well, you need to." This was during that year. He said, "You need to have a team that, does really well and maybe gets to the Final Four." Well, it happens. We not only get a Final Four team, but a championship game team. And I thought, naive as I was at that time, that automatically that was going to translate into maybe a Missouri Valley Game of the Week on ABC or something. Didn't quite turn out that way, but it was still a great introduction and something that I will always remember. And a side note to that, Ed McKee was the SID at Indiana State during Larry Bird's tenure there and a few years afterward. And Ed and I became friends from early in my days as the SID at the University of Tulsa, and then, of course, working for the Missouri Valley Conference. And so we go after that. I end up leaving the Valley a few years later, and I end up going to the WAC. Ed goes on his own way, and he ends up with the Indiana Pacers and has a great career, ultimately at George Washington University. And as things would have it, a few years ago, Ed ends up moving to Denver, where I live, and we've been able to reconnect, get together for lunch on occasion, and get to reminisce a little bit. So it's kind of come full circle.
Yeah, I think when you have this 40-year career in college athletics, you get a lot of connections that cross paths. A lot of people moving around too. So, the Missouri Valley Conference is an interesting one because it's most associated with basketball, and obviously there's Arch Madness, the league's postseason basketball tournament that has a pretty rich history. The conference has launched some marquee players and coaches into the national spotlight. So what did you find interesting about a conference that really led with basketball, which is not necessarily the norm in the college athletic landscape? The SEC, the Big Ten, as great as basketball is in the Big Ten, it leads with football. The SEC certainly leads with football. The Missouri Valley leads with basketball. What was kind of intriguing about that?
Well, it was interesting at the time because at that time, the Missouri Valley was a conference that was kind of a mix of different sorts, in that it also played football. And it had, we have to go to different terms in those days, but there was 1A, 1AA, and 1AAA. So 1A was, the larger football schools. 1AA was, which today would be the CFA, or not the CFA, but the smaller football
subdivision, I think it's called, yeah,
subdivision of Division I, and 1AAA were the non-football playing schools. The Valley had all three. So Tulsa and New Mexico State at that time were the what I'll call the 1A football coach, or in today's parlance, the FBS level football coaches or football schools. And kind of go back to West Texas State was in the conference. Indiana State, Southern Illinois, Drake were all FCS level football schools, or 1AA football schools. Creighton and Bradley, in particular, were non-football playing schools in the conference. And ultimately, there was other expansion that took place. Illinois State came into the conference. It was a football playing school. And so we had a little bit of everything, but it was still, even with that said, it still was primarily a basketball conference. It had a rich history, as everybody knows, dating back to Cincinnati and Memphis, Louisville, all being Valley members at one time. But I remember most about it was I came in at a time when it not only was a strong basketball conference, but there were some iconic coaches in the league then and some players in the league then. And just to give you an example, I'll take Bradley University. Joe Stoll was a I call a Hall of Fame coach there at that time. Played in Robertson Fieldhouse, which was basically an extended airplane hangar that held 7,000 people, and it was just a great place to watch a basketball game. Great tradition. He had some really good players. Mitchell Anderson, Roger Fegley, Hersey Hawkins that came through Bradley. really a great basketball program. And later, after Joel Stoll retired, I had a coach come in by the name of Dick Versace. And Dick was very flamboyant, very media savvy, always out in front of things, and really got the program going even more than it already was. A great person to came at the right time. We'll put it that way. When I came in, Tom Apke was at Creighton, another guy who had great deal of success, followed eventually by Willis Reed, the former New York Knicks great. And Willis had a 7-foot center there named Benoit Benjamin, who was a heck of a player. And just having a guy like Willis and getting able to meet him and to work with him, to me, that was, I'm not starstruck by many, but he was one that I was, and I have to admit that. Just the other coaches and players at that time, Gene Smithson of Wichita State. They had Aubrey Sherrod. They had Antoine Carr. And later on, a guy named Xavier McDaniel, who ended up leading the nation, one of only 3 players to ever lead the nation in scoring and rebounding. And he actually led the nation in rebounding, I want to say 2 or 4 years. And the 2 that he didn't, it was Akeem Olajuwon and David Robinson who did. So that gives you an idea of the kind of player he was. And he had a pretty good NBA career, mostly with the Boston Celtics. And so people like that. A guy named Lewis Lloyd played for Drake University. Bob Ortegal was a coach at that time. Very, very great player nationally. And Drake had a good program. So there was just a number of players that played a little bit under the radar. Obviously, Bird didn't, but some that did. And the Valley was still a very strong league from a basketball standpoint at that time. And then, later on, became even stronger and made a lot of good moves, even though some schools left. Doug Elgin, who was a longtime commissioner, did a great job keeping the Valley not only afloat, but keeping the Valley strong. And from a basketball sense, and I would argue today that it's even a stronger basketball league today than it has been in any previous years.
Yeah, there was a great run there where they had multiple bids into the NCAA tournament too. So, so you moved from the Valley to the Western Athletic Conference, the WAC, in 1985. When you get there in 1985, how would you characterize the state of the WAC at that point?
At that point, it was, even though it had made some changes, a very stable league. Had a reputation as a wide open football league. Along with it had a strong basketball reputation, but really, as you alluded to earlier, football was the driving force at that time in the WAC. I got there the year after Brigham Young won the National Football Championship, and my first game was, they started the next year in New York playing, if I recall correctly, Boston. I think it was Boston College, in the Giant Stadium there, and it was. It was a fun time, and it was a wide open league. I mean, there were 40, 50 passes a game for most teams. The exception being the Air Force Academy, which ran the wishbone that nobody could stop. So even though they didn't throw the ball like everybody else did, nobody else could figure out what kind of offense they were running. So very strong league at that time, but also widespread. It spread from that time from the Front Range in Colorado to the University of Hawaii, and went to the West Coast with San Diego State, at that time, and later on San Jose State came into the conference. But just one that was kind of had its own niche. The Pac at that time, Pac-8, later became the Pac-10 and 12, was out there, but the WAC had its niche, and very, very fun league, and very fun league to work in.
Accurate to say probably the second best athletic conference in the Western U.S. I mean, behind
at
the
that
Pac,
time, without question.
Pretty clear.
Yeah, without question.
And you hitting at this a little bit. I mean, I think the WAC, when you get there, I mean, especially and then into the 90s, certainly there are some high quality college basketball in the WAC. So you got programs like UNLV, Utah, BYU, Fresno State. You got big personality coaches like Rick Majerus and Jerry Tarkanian. You got up and comers like Bill Self. You got players like Tim Hardaway and Keith Van Horn. When you reflect on that period of the WAC, what memories stand out? What are the players, the coaches, the teams? what made the conference's hoop scene kind of lively and exciting?
Well, you hit on part of it with some of the players that you mentioned. When Rick Majerus came to Utah, Utah had a strong program, but Rick really elevated it. And they had my most significant memory would be the year, I think it was 1998, when Utah went all the way to the Final Two. I lost to Kentucky and San Antonio in that year, but had the number 1 draft choice in the NBA draft, or number 2 draft choice.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael Doliak, who went in the NCAA draft, in the NBA draft that year. A lot of people remember Keith Van Horn, but he wasn't on that team. He came afterwards, and Utah still had a great team. I also remember in the mid '80s, University of Wyoming, a guy named Eric Lechner, Fennis Dembo. They became a national player at that time. Jim Brandenburg was their head coach. Also, a guy who gained a lot of attention as a head coach. But it was really, you hit on it with some of the flamboyant coaches that were in the conference at the time. BYU, obviously, always a strong basketball program. Liddell Anderson and Roger Reed were the coaches I remember there. Also had a lot of very good players that came through BYU. But just a league that, for a league with the institutions it had, for the sizes of those schools, was as strong a league as you could probably have football and basketball wise. It wasn't a Big 8 or a Big 12 or something like that. Very strong, very wide open, very fun league.
And the WAC enjoys some real relative stability from its 1962 founding until 1999. You had some founding members in Arizona and Arizona State. They departed for the Pac-10 in 1978. But the conference, other than that, is pretty healthy. It's stable. It features a number of established brand name universities. So explain to our listeners what happens in 1999.
Well, really, you go back to 1995-96 when the WAC at that time was a 10-team conference. And the Cliff Notes version of that is that the league's board of directors at that time and the league's administrators, athletic directors at that time had met, and we looked at expansion as a conference. And Joe Kearney, who was the commissioner of the league at that time and the man who hired me, had come to the WAC after being the athletic director at Michigan State, at the University of Washington, and at Arizona State. So he had a very strong background, and the league was full of very strong and experienced athletic directors at that time. Glenn Tuckett at BYU would be one of them. Fun McGraw at Colorado State at that time. Paul Roach at the University of Wyoming. Guys who have been around for a long time. And the league was a 10-team league, had decided it was going to try to expand to 12. And today that wouldn't even get anybody's attention. Just going to add 2. But it was also at a time when the Southwest Conference lost 4 of its members when the Big 8 was going to become the Big 12 at that time. And the Southwest Conference, which was primarily a Texas-based conference with the University of Arkansas, was basically eliminated. And some of their schools went to the Big 12. Some of them were looking for a home. And the WAC board of directors at that time had decided that, hey, and this was done in a very short period of time, decided that, look, let's take a look at some of the Southwest Conference schools, expand our footprint, and see if we can't increase our prominence, our media markets, our exposure. And that led to the addition of Rice University in Houston. That time, TCU and SMU came into the league, and we had Louisiana Tech, which was also came into the conference. And out of that part of the country, and then on the western part, in order to get some kind of a balance there too, on the western part, that's when UNLV and San Jose State came into the league, and the University of Tulsa came into the league too. And so that's what led to a 16-team WAC. at that time, and we're probably ahead of our time a little bit. It's one of those things that on paper, I think I got ahead of myself here with one of those schools, but it was at a time.
Well, it's interesting because I think this is pretty informative for where we are today, because you start to see some of the things you've talked about here in the mid 1990s, expanding our footprint, media rights. These are things we're seeing in high dialogue today, which is really, I think where we're going to spend a good chunk of our conversation a little bit moving on. But so let's kind of progress forward then. How does the conference, you get these new schools in the mid 90s, how does the conference then kind of just fall into all these different directions then?
Well, when the expansion first happened and we got to 16, I think in hindsight, and hindsight's always 20/20 as we know, what led to its demise was actually what we were trying to make happen, is that was lack of revenue to feed 16 miles instead of 10. We had just finalized a 7-year national deal with ESPN prior to that expansion that was lucrative for 10, not so lucrative for 16. The other thing that led to its demise was the loss of rivalries. And when you have 16 schools, you're not going to play a 15-game conference schedule. You're not going to play a 30-game conference basketball schedule, and then you get into even some of the other sports. And then the geography of that conference was such that you couldn't divide it 8-8 on a geographic basis. It was a 9-7 split geographically. That also led to some turmoil, and so it only lasted for 3 years. Now that said, the first year we have our first ever college football championship game. It's played in Las Vegas between BYU and, if I recall correctly, Wyoming, and it's a sellout there. It's an ABC midday or mid-Saturday game of the week, or not game of the week, but championship game. Had a great rating. We thought we were off and running, but that unfortunately didn't last. And it really, for the reasons I just mentioned, loss of rivalries, and simply not having enough revenue to keep everybody happy. And that led to a meeting of some board members that led to the creation of the Mountain West Conference, which is, I always called it the WAC South because that's what it was. But the Mountain West was the break off of the WAC. It took 8 schools. The WAC remained with 8, but had a giant hole in the middle. And so, since that time, there's been a lot of other movement, both in the Mountain West standpoint and with the WAC standpoint. WAC ended up losing football as a sport through various transactions that took place. Conference movement. At one time, of the 32 conferences in the country, 29 of them were affected in one way or another by expansion. They either had someone come in or someone leave. And the WAC, probably more than any other conference in the country, had more come in and more leave. It was literally a revolving door for about 10 years.
And driven by football.
Driven by football.
Correct. And so how did this, these are all the WAC's composition changes pretty radically, driven by football. So how did that change the trajectory of the conference, particularly as it relates to its basketball? Because some of those who left in 1999, those are strong basketball histories. That's UNLV, that's BYU, that's New Mexico. So how did hoops change?
Well, the expansion to 16, I don't think hoops changed at the time. I'll give you an example of that. At the time we went to 16, because if you look at that year that Utah went to the national championship game, that was a year of the 16-team WAC. And at that particular year, the league had 7 20-game winners, had 3 top 20 teams, and it seemed to be headed, in a great direction.
So this experiment then, I guess, or this expansion, let's call it, this works on the basketball side. It did at the time, because the WAC was, or at least a small sample size, but it was geared towards football for this reason. The WAC had five bowl contracts, had 5 bowl teams the year before, and we knew that the television and television revenue was driven by football. It was not driven by basketball. And we were fortunate that we had a strong basketball side to us,
quite frankly, we were looking to try to figure out a way to increase football revenues in a way to grow the league, and at the same time increase our market size. Good idea, good thoughts. Unfortunately, we were a little before our time, to be honest.
Yeah. And, we've seen conferences evolve and change before, and certainly since, this expansion that the WAC did in 99, but that WAC reshuffling in 99 was rather seismic at the time. So if we look back on that period now, what would it tell us about where things were heading in college athletics? You mentioned we were a little bit ahead of our time. So what is the WAC story there before the turn of the century tell us about where college football was headed, or college sports, I should say, was headed?
Well, I think all you have to do is look at all the transactions or the, I guess, movement that took place in conferences after that. The trickle down. Let's take it in the West. The trickle down was when the WAC split. At that time, the Big West was playing football, and Nevada and UNLV and Boise State and those institutions were playing football in the Big West. Well, the WAC still had the name recognition, the football cash at that time, and so that's where we went. We went to Boise, we went to Fresno State, Fresno was in the league at that time, but played in the Big West prior to that, and then to Nevada, to Utah State eventually, to bring them into our conference to bolster our football. We were fortunate because even though we had lost a lot of our good football members, we also gained some. Boise State was that time was the program on the rise that nobody knew about. And as we all know, they ended up, going to the Fiesta Bowl, upsetting Oklahoma. I remember walking out of the stadium after that game, thinking, if the WAC implodes tomorrow, we've hit the jackpot here with that game happening. Boise actually went back to the Fiesta Bowl a couple of years later to play. Well, a former WAC member, TCU, that had left the league, and so that we experienced some good times there. And the University of Nevada had a very good football program that went to a few bowl games. That was, people probably don't remember this, but Colin Kaepernick was the quarterback at the University of Nevada during those years. Chris Alt, one of the great football coaches in college sports, was the coach there. Fresno State had many great years under Pat Hill, so we still had a lot of football strength, but eventually that eroded because as the Mountain West, the schools they had taken from some of the schools they had taken from the WAC, and specifically Utah, BYU, ultimately move on to different conferences. Who do they replace them with? Well, they take the top of the WAC, replace them, with them, Boise State, Nevada, Fresno State. And so that's eventually, from a WAC standpoint, football became a real difficult sport to maintain. And one of the things that happens when movement takes place, not just conference to conference, but throughout the country, is a certain amount of panic sets in. So we had added some schools in Texas to play as football, members in the WAC, full members, but as FBS football conferences. Texas San Antonio was one of them. Texas State was one of them. Louisiana Tech, obviously, we had in the league a little bit earlier, but we end up losing some schools to Conference USA. We have to replace them. It's just movement just continues, and we could never stabilize ourselves, I guess was the best way to put it. We could never get something that would maintain itself, say, for a 5-year period even. We were literally, it seemed like, losing someone or adding somebody almost every year over a 10 to 12-year period.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's such a counter to the first 30 some years of the league when there was great stability, with the exception of Arizona and Arizona State leaving. Then it becomes, like, you mentioned a revolving door a little bit. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. The conference realignment, you spent 40 years in college sports, and you're retired now, and so no one can fire you. So the conference realignment we're seeing today, Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, USC and UCLA to the Big Ten, and then there's trickle down to these big power players moving, right? That's fueled by that football and TV money. Where does that leave college basketball?
That's a really good question. It's really fueled expansion in simplest terms. It's fueled by two things. One of them is survival, which I would say that was the WAC stance after a while, trying to survive as it continued to lose members. And the other one is to increase revenue through increasing exposure. And that's the simplest way to put it. Sure, there are other reasons, but those are the two primary ones. And ultimately, everything comes down to money. Remember, my dad told me that one time. If you ever want to know the answer to something, follow the money, because that's where it goes. And I think when you talk about, say, a Southern Cal and UCLA moving, to the Big Ten, or Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, that's expansion, and that is a revenue grab on a whole different level than most of the other conferences that expand. And that's, unfortunately, I think there are other things that get hurt by it, but that's where we are in this world today. And that's, any commissioner's job is a really difficult one. Any athletic director's job is a very difficult one. And we alluded to it earlier, because of all the bosses you have and the people you have to respond to, and what your goal is, what you're directed to do. And every conference, wants to strengthen itself. Every conference wants to increase its visibility, and every conference wants to increase its revenue. So, at what point does that become the overriding factor versus, kind of the traditional conference setup and traditional conference rivalries, and hold the whole idea of intercollegiate athletics as it once was?
When these shakeups happen, Jeff, what's lost? Specifically on the basketball side, what do we lose?
Well, I think on the basketball side, what gets lost is a couple of things. I think the obvious things that are lost, one are regional traditional rivalries get lost somewhere in that shuffle in basketball. And if you take, and I'll give you an example, and this is at the top of the list, when UCLA and Southern Cal go to the Big Ten, I wouldn't say that, when you start losing, your traditional rivals that were in the Pac-12, the Washingtons, Stanford, Oregon State, those schools, Arizona State, if things remain the way they are today, who knows if that's going to happen? You do lose that. You lose some identity as a conference. You lose some of your fan base and the ability of fans to relate to what the conference is trying to get done and what they're doing. You lose that. You lose, in my opinion, I think you lose some of the whole idea of intercollegiate athletics being an amateur sport. And it, I know people will say that's an overreaction. Some people will say it's an overreaction, but I don't like the way it's headed. I think college athletics in general, especially at the Division I level, is somewhat off the tracks right now. But I also sit here today, and I'd be, I don't know what's going to happen, but I will be absolutely shocked if the landscape that we have today, knowing what's going to take place in a couple of years, is still the same a couple of years from now. There will be other movement that takes place that also will change the lineup even more than it already is. What that will be is difficult to say, but I think one thing we can safely say is it'll all be related in some way to revenue and exposure.
Well, I mean, let's stick on that point a little bit then, Jeff. When you look into that crystal ball, and I have to imagine that's hazier than it's ever been, and you've seen in college sports. So, where do you think this is all heading? Where do you see college sports a decade down the road, and specifically college basketball?
I think college basketball. This is. I'm going to just point out a couple of conferences, and I don't have any inside information. But if you take the Big East, for example, you take the Atlantic 10, for example.
Basketball-centric conferences, no question.
Basketball-centric conferences. What are they in their meetings? What are they talking about? What are they looking at? Does it or the Big West, or not the Big West? Excuse me, the West Coast at this time. Another basketball-centric conference that's probably a little top-heavy, but still a very good basketball conference on the West Coast. Now, is there a movement that will take place that we may think today doesn't make sense? And as an example, we'll use Gonzaga. Does a Big East, does a Atlantic 10, is there some other formation of conglomeration of schools that decides, hey, we need to make our own way in this? Does something happen there? Logic tells me no, but logic also tells me, don't be shocked by anything. Um, so, that could be the way I see it. What I'm concerned about, and maybe this is me being too old school, I'm concerned that the NCAA tournament will become more of a not just a survival of the fittest to a certain extent, and that the mid majors and the smaller basketball institutions, the very ones who, in my opinion, make the basketball tournament what it is today. Um,
Even though they're not winning, they give it a lot of great
they're
energy.
not winning, but they make the tournament what it is.
Yeah, they give it energy.
What's the best part of the NCAA tournament? In my opinion, it's that first weekend.
Absolutely.
And to a lesser extent, but also to a greater extent, even the Sweet 16, when there's always seemingly always a Cinderella that's there, and that's the appeal to a great extent to me and to many fans, I think, throughout the country of the tournament. But if it becomes a money grab, and if it becomes a power conference event to the detriment of the smaller and the mid-major conferences, that's my fear. I hope that doesn't happen. I think there are some of those at the bigger conferences who probably do not want that to happen. But at the same time, television networks get involved in these things also, and the revenues that are involved in that can also play a role. I have a great deal of respect for the commissioners at the Power Five conferences. They're all very smart men. They're all very cognizant of the greater good of the landscape, the national landscape. But their primary obligation is to their own conference, and so that's where I think college basketball could be affected. And if the NCAA tournament remains to the greater extent that it is today, then it can continue to grow. But my fear is that may not happen.
So what do you think? Because you talk about the NCAA tournament, and that is so important to college basketball and the universities and conferences beyond the traditional Power Five, and let's even throw the Big East in there because it's such a powerful basketball conference. In your eyes, what do you think the future of the NCAA tournament looks like in 5 years, 10 years down the line?
Well, I do think what I think it will look like, barring some expansion of the field, which is unlikely. But again, you never say never to anything. But barring an expansion of the field, I think it's going to become a primarily a tournament that's for the top 100 schools in the country that are all involved in power conferences. Either that, or they'll ultimately, and this is one thing I don't necessarily believe it's going to happen, but I believe it could happen at some point, a split where the power conferences take over, and they have, in essence, the NCAA basketball tournament becomes a Power 5 tournament or a Power 4 tournament, whatever that number of conferences should be. And the rest of the conferences are.
So it becomes a big boys, and then it becomes the middle class or the lower
middle class, and then you get, this may sound funny, but you get basically an NCAA tournament there, and then you have the smallers as I'm going to use the term NIT, which it wouldn't be, but they may have.
It's a secondary March Madness
level. Yes.
Interesting. You hear a lot about kind of, and I think that's what's scary about where all this is heading. It's so driven by football, and for college basketball fans like those at 19.9, it's scary to think about. This great tradition we have in our sport maybe being very much changed and fueled by football. So, Jeff, you had this nearly 50-year run in college sports. I wanted to get a sense for you. What's the greatest thing about college sports? And then what's the worst thing about college sports?
I think the greatest thing about college sports are the opportunities provided to thousands of student athletes across the country at all levels. And at one time, I have two sons who were both Division I baseball players in college. One was a scholarship player, one was a walk-on. Both of them had great opportunities, and appreciated that. And the vast majority of student athletes that play, the vast majority of them play at Division II or Division III, and that's the essence of intercollegiate athletics, where you don't have too much of to a great extent, politics don't play a great role in that as they do in Division One. So I think that's it. It provides opportunities not just for competition, but for growth. Experience team concepts, becoming students, working towards a profession other than professional football or professional baseball or whatever it might be. That, and I understand that's a Pollyannish look at things, but to me that's the greatest thing about sports. Even at the Division One level, that's one of the greatest things about it, because as we all know, in terms of professional sports, 1 or 2% of those who play in college will end up going professional. So still provides opportunities. It provides access to education that you may not have if you weren't an athlete. I think that's very important. So that's the best thing about it. The worst thing about it, to me, is the increasingly the increased influence, and this is a double-edged sword. I will say that from the start. The increased influence of media, both from a financial standpoint and how intercollegiate athletics is run. You got scouting services. You have guys on some networks all the time talking about and they're rating kids coming out of high school. They're going to be going into college, and they're the top 100, the top 200, the top 300. Television has provided both the good and the bad. The good, obviously, is exposure. It's increased the awareness throughout the nation, hell, throughout the world, of what athletics really is and the advantages of it. At the same time, the increased revenue involved that comes from media, which you need, has also led to much of the expansion and much of the transition and of conferences today. Some to the point where they may not survive, and that's I don't think I'm being too unrealistic when I say that. I think that's very possible, but I'm trying to criticize something I spent most of my life in, and I don't mean it as a criticism. I'm just saying that's reality. And as politics become more involved in college athletics, so do the influence of those who turn out to be the bad part of college athletics, the influence of boosters, the influence of money that gets trickled down in one form or another to athletes. That's the bad side to it, and the influence is not just boosters, but others who are involved behind the scenes that cause some of the problems that we hear about on occasion today. So that's the bad side to it. I don't know that it's ever possible to eradicate all of that, and maybe that's just the nature of the beast. When money's involved, all kinds of different types of individuals become involved.
Follow the money, right?
Follow the money, and that's you'll get to the bottom line. And I think, unfortunately, and again, I don't want to sound too detrimental to this, but when you have a system now where university presidents, in some cases, are too involved, and in some cases, not enough involved. But that said, the bigger issue to me is they are, in essence, they're not in a position of power in some cases. They're in a position that they have boosters and or coaches involved who are significantly more powerful than they are, whether it's politically or just in reality, just simply more powerful. And I don't think that's healthy. Maybe it's unavoidable in the system we have, but I just don't think it's healthy.
Yeah. Jeff, you've been close to the college sports for 50 years and close to college basketball. I know you're a fan as well of the game. So before we get out of here, I just want to hit you with some quick hit styled questions to close out the show. So I'm going to presume the best player you ever saw was Larry Bird. Guy averaged 29 and 15 and is one of the game's all-time greats. So I'm going to assume he's the best you ever saw. I'm curious about who is the most exciting player you ever saw.
I would say I got to think about this a little bit because I saw a lot. In terms of just pure excitement, and if you're talking about where I worked or just throughout the country,
you could go either direction here.
Well, I'll first of all take it from where the players I saw the most in my own leagues, whether it was the Missouri Valley or the WAC. A name I'll mention a lot of people won't probably recognize was Lewis Lloyd at Drake. He was certainly one that I saw and Keith Van Horn, who played at Utah, was he was a Larry Bird Jr., if you want to put it that way. He wasn't quite Larry Bird, but he's pretty good and played very much like him. And so those two guys in general. Antoine Carr played at Wichita State. Very exciting player to watch. Very talented. Xavier McDaniel, same. Nationally, I don't think. I mean, there's a number of players, but my choice is probably the same as everyone else's. Patrick Ewing at Georgetown. Michael Jordan at North Carolina. Certainly, they hit the top of the list. We can go down NBA rosters and you can pick them right out. Guys who were great all-time basketball players, exciting players to watch, guys who could turn a game, but take over control of a game by themselves.
Yeah. All right. So you were the sports information director at Tulsa, director of PR for the Valley. Then the commissioner of the WAC. So you have you're in a lot of contact with college basketball coaches. Which basketball coach was the most, let's say, colorful?
Without question, in my mind, Dick Versace at Bradley University was the most colorful person I ever dealt with. To give you a quick story, we have the time for it. Dick and I was a young guy. I was a young guy who thought I had all the answers, and I really didn't have any. Dick and I didn't always get along. I lived in Tulsa at the time. I came home one summer day, and I walk in my house, and guess who's sitting in my living room talking to my wife? Dick Versace. Came down to say hello, said, hey, we need to clear the air on a few things. We sat out in my patio, had a glass of wine, and talked. Totally unexpected, but that's one of the things that happened. He was certainly one of them. Rick Majerus at Utah, another one for a different reason than Dick. Rick wasn't always as media-oriented, although he was in a sly way, as Dick was. Rick was as much as a self-promoter as Dick was, but still very, very interesting and very, very fun to deal with. So those were the two guys that stand out to me. Oh, a third one, Nolan Richardson, University of Tulsa. Nolan, and later went on to win a national championship at Arkansas. Great coach, great individual, and just a guy that I consider a friend today. He was just a great guy.
It's really interesting because you mentioned earlier the Indiana State, New Mexico State game. And Nolan Richardson, that Larry Bird played in, there in 78, 79 season. Nolan Richardson in his Hall of Fame speech references that game. And he talks about how he's listening to it on the radio. And it's Bird shoots again, hits it, Bird for three, Bird, and all Bird, this. And he goes, man, that brother is good. And then he saw the newspaper the next day. That brother is white. So that's Nolan Richardson's Hall of Fame speech and references that game you mentioned earlier. So, what is your favorite arena to take in a basketball game? Where it was like, wow, this is pretty cool.
My favorite arena of all time, and there's a couple, but my favorite of all time was New Mexico.
The Pit.
The Pit. In terms of a arena built solely for basketball, seats 17,000. When it was full, it was as lively as an arena could get.
Awesome. Best rivalry you witnessed?
BYU,
which one had
Utah.
a little bit extra juice? BYU, Utah, the Holy War.
BYU, Utah, without question.
All right. We're going to ask you a last one here that really references the present day. I want you to fill in the blank for me here. NIL is...
necessary, but headed in the wrong direction.
Has it been interesting to you? Because it seems that the NCAA has just basically said, taken a complete hands-off approach to it. Is that surprising?
Yes, it is surprising, but also I understand why. Because the NCAA has been looking for federal intervention to try to solve the problems that are being created by NIL. And this is one where I really hope I'm wrong. I don't think that's realistic. You can't rely on the federal government, I don't think, to solve a problem that's in essence is created by individual states all having different sets of laws that apply to NIL. And I just don't see that happening, and I hope I'm wrong. NIL is a good concept that has totally gone off the rails, and it's changing the landscape of intercollegiate athletics. And you have, there's the expression a lot of people like to use is, well, NIL can't be related to performance, on the field performance. Well, that's just a fallacy. That's exactly what it's related to. And if you want to know where the money's going, all you got to do is look at those schools that are the most visible.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, let's end it there and let you slide back into retirement here this evening. Thanks for joining us here on the 19.9 podcast.
I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the 19.9 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 19.9 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time,